We have not been able to come up with a clever strategy for attacking Iran and causing regime change, getting rid of the ballistic missiles, whatever. We have no strategy. And Iran, on the other hand, can retaliate by hitting Israel, hitting military targets that belong to the United States in the Middle East, and closing the Straits of Hormuz. So we're in a real pickle here. They made a huge mistake here. This situation we're now facing is a huge blunder on Trump's part. He boxed himself in. He thought he could be Mr. Tough Guy, send this armada to the Middle East, and get the Iranians to cave. Anybody who knows anything about Iran could have told you that this was just not going to work. He goofed big time. And now he's in a box. And the question is, how does he get out of this box? And if you're the Chinese, you don't want to help him get out of this box. If you're the Chinese, you want to keep him in the box. The same thing applies to Ukraine. If I'm China, do I want to see the Ukraine war end? Or do I prefer to see the Americans bogged down in Ukraine forever? And the answer is, I want to see them bogged down in Ukraine forever. I want to see them bogged down in the Caribbean forever. And I want to see them bogged down in the Middle East forever, because then they can't pivot to Asia. The Trump administration took extraordinary measures over the course of 2025 to wreck the Iranian economy, all for the purpose of fermenting an uprising. And by late December, they had succeeded, and the protests had started, and the protests were picking up speed over the course of January. And what the administration wanted to do was use the protests, which it was fueling, by the way, along with the Israelis and the British. We had CIA people in Iran, and Mossad was very active in Iran, and we were helping to fuel the protest. And the idea was that once the protest really began to pick up speed, we would bring in American military power, air power, to work with the protesters to effect regime change. Regime change was the goal. What we were doing in 2020 to strangle the economy and cause these protests was working toward a strategy for regime change. This is very important to understand. And we understood that to get regime change, you needed boots on the ground. The boots on the ground were the Iranian protesters. Trump is a very smart guy in some ways, and he understands that the last thing you want to do is put American boots on the ground. But the protesters were the boots on the ground, and we would bring in the air power. Now, what happened on January 8th? Remember, the protest started on December 28th. What happened on January 8th is that the Iranian government cracked down on the protesters. And what happened by January 14th is that we understood, as did the Kane camp, that we no longer had boots on the ground. The protests had effectively been shut down by January 14th. So we, in effect, called off the military operation. And as I said before, you also want to remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu called up Trump, and he too was not enthusiastic about an operation. So that's what happened in the first half of this year. Now, fast forward to the present. The big problem we face is that there are no protests. There are no boots on the ground that we can work with. So what we have to do is go in there with air power alone. And we have to effect regime change that way, because regime change is the only meaningful goal you can have here. You talk about the nuclear capabilities. We basically wrecked the nuclear capabilities last June. It's not like there's a big target set involving nuclear capabilities that we see as a danger that has to immediately be taken off the table. That damage was done last June. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about regime change. And if we don't talk about regime change, the other objective that's on the table, which the Israelis insist on, is Iran's ballistic missile capability. So then the question is, do you think that we can use that air power and naval power that we have in the Gulf, absent boots on the ground, to topple the regime? And I think the answer is almost certainly no. Or to lower our sights a bit and just go after the missiles and solve the missile problem with the forces that we have in the region. And I think the answer is no on that count as well. And I just want to emphasize that there are sort of two reasons for this. One is, if you just look at what kind of offensive capability we have, and you can include the Israelis in the equation, the Israelis and the Americans, what kind of offensive striking power we have against Iran, we don't have enough. And I could walk you through some of those numbers. But secondly, we can't deal with the fact that the Iranians have viable options for responding. The Israelis are going to get slammed. They're going to get slammed by Iranian ballistic missiles. I could walk you through that story. We can go back and talk about what happened in the January 12th war, the January 25 war, the 12-day war, straight through the Strait of Hormuz moves. One of the reasons that Trump ended the war on June 25th, we're going back to the 12-day war, which started June 13th and ended June 25th. One of the reasons that Trump ended it on June 25th was that he caught wind that the Iranians were talking about shutting down the Straits of Hormuz. And this really spooked Trump, as it should have. And you want to remember the Israelis. It's the Israelis who wanted to end the war after 12 days, not the Iranians. There were numerous people, I was one of them, who were surprised that the Iranians agreed to end the 12-day war, because the Israelis were losing in their effort to stop the ballistic missiles from coming in. They were running out of defensive missiles, and the Iranians were getting quite sophisticated in the tactics they were employing to penetrate the Israeli defenses. So the Israelis wanted to end the war on June 25th. On January 14th of this year, it was Netanyahu who asked Trump not to attack because Israel could not defend itself then. So you just want to understand that Israel is really going to be pounded, and those American assets in the Middle East are going to be targeted. And furthermore, the Iranians have committed themselves to shutting down the Straits of Hormuz. So this is why Kane is telling Trump that we don't have a good military option. Iran is going to have many more ballistic missiles a year from now than it has today. And furthermore, all the evidence is that the Chinese especially, but also the Russians, are working more and more with the Iranians. And you're going to have the United States and Israel on one side, and Iran and China and Russia on the other side, in ways that have not been the case until recently. The Iranians and the Chinese have almost consummated a deal where China will sell sophisticated anti-ship missiles to Iran. Iran has already moved away from GPS and has adopted the Chinese navigation system. And the Chinese have sold sophisticated defensive missiles and a sophisticated radar that will help the Iranians detect stealth aircraft. So what's going to happen with the passage of time here is that the Chinese are going to get more involved in the defense of Iran. There's going to be a closer relationship between China and Iran and between Russia and Iran over time, which is going to make it exceedingly difficult for us, the United States. You remember, during the Cold War, the Soviets were a major presence in the Middle East. And of course, the United States was a major presence in the Middle East. And the two of us, the Soviets and the Americans, were at odds in the Middle East throughout most of the Cold War. And I think moving forward, as China gets more and more powerful, and it develops a blue water navy and more power projection capability, its influence in the Middle East will be greater and greater. And of course, it'll be at odds with us on all sorts of issues. And I think Iran is one of those issues. So I think the Israeli sense, and I would imagine the American sense as well, is that now is the time to go after Iran before Iran really solidifies its relationship with China and Russia, before it gets even more missiles, especially hypersonic missiles. Because you understand that the Iranians recognize, given what happened in the 12-day war last June, that ballistic missiles are their ace in the hole. Some people argue, by the way, that Iran doesn't need to develop nuclear weapons because they have ballistic missiles. And given their ballistic missile capability, and given that Israel is such a tiny country and such a ripe target for all those ballistic missiles, they don't need nukes. They can just rely on their missiles as a powerful deterrent down the road. So I don't think you're going to get regime change. And if you do get regime change, I don't think it's going to matter much. But furthermore, with regard to China, China and the United States are adversaries, and China has a deep-seated interest in making sure there is no regime change in Iran. Countries like China are appalled by America's efforts at regime change. In Europe, you love regime change because you bought into the American agenda. During the unipolar moment, you ran around the world with us toppling regimes. You think that's great. You want to make everybody look like Europe. You want to make everybody look like the United States. But if you're at the other end of the rifle barrel, that's not a very promising picture. The Chinese and the Russians don't like regime change because if you go back to the unipolar moment, liberal hegemony was designed to produce regime change in Russia and designed to produce regime change in China. Our ultimate goal during the unipolar moment was to turn China into a liberal democracy. Now, you might like that, but if you're Chinese, that's not a very attractive outcome. You don't want regime change, and therefore, you don't want regime change in countries like Iran or North Korea. What you want in those cases is to have close relations with Iran and North Korea and Russia. So all of this emphasis on regime change has, if anything, pushed the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans closer together. They made a huge mistake here. This situation we're now facing is a huge blunder on Trump's part. He boxed himself in. He thought he could be Mr. Tough Guy, send this armada to the Middle East, and get the Iranians to cave. Anybody who knows anything about Iran could have told you that this was just not going to work. The idea that the Iranians would cave in because of what happened to President Maduro in Venezuela is not a serious argument. He goofed big time, and now he's in a box. And the question is, how does he get out of this box? And if you're the Chinese, you don't want to help him get out of this box. If you're the Chinese, you want to keep him in the box. The same thing applies to Ukraine. If I'm China, do I want to see the Ukraine war end, or do I prefer to see the Americans bogged down in Ukraine forever? And the answer is, I want to see them bogged down in Ukraine forever. I want to see them bogged down in the Caribbean forever. And I want to see them bogged down in the Middle East forever, because then they can't pivot to Asia. You look at all of those naval and air assets that we have in the Middle East now, and you listen to General Kane talk, and you listen to other military people talk. We can sustain about a week-long war. And you know what's going to happen? We're going to run out of munitions. And you want to think about what the consequences of that are for East Asia and for containing China. We have 800 Tomahawk missiles. That's our Sunday punch. 800 Tomahawk missiles in the Middle East, by most accounts. By my estimation, from searching around on the internet, we have a total of about 4,000 Tomahawks. We're going to need those Tomahawks against China. You'll burn through 800 Tomahawks in 2 days, and then you'll start pulling Tomahawks out of that inventory of 4,000. And if you get into a protracted war with Iran, and almost everybody agrees you're not going to win a quick and decisive victory, it's going to be a protracted war. You're not going to have any Tomahawks left very quickly. What are the consequences for containing China? THAAD missiles. We used up a quarter of our THAAD missiles. These are defensive missiles, high-altitude defense missiles. We used up a quarter of our THAAD missiles in the 12-day war diet. We've used up huge numbers of Patriot missiles in various scenarios. We just have no manufacturing base anymore. We ran down the manufacturing base during the unipolar moment. So the idea that we can pump out huge numbers of weapons quickly to replace the weapons that we lost is just not the case. And that's certainly true when you're dealing with sophisticated weapons like THAAD, Tomahawk, Patriot, and so forth. And just in terms of the U.S. Navy, we have the pedal to the metal in terms of using our carriers. And it's quite clear that the sailors on the Ford, the USS Ford, the carrier that's now moving into the Middle East and was previously in the Caribbean for the Venezuela operation, the sailors on that ship are just outraged that they didn't get to go back to dry dock and see their families. And instead, they're on another mission. And who knows how long that will last. I mean, we're really running our carriers hard, and this has consequences. And again, our naval power and air power should be concentrated in East Asia. It should not be concentrated in the Middle East or the Caribbean. And Trump, you know, I'm not a Trump fan, but in a very important way, Trump has a good strategic nose. He understands that you don't want boots on the ground. He understands that you don't want to get into democracy promotion and so forth. He likes to use military force. He's used military force 7 times against 7 different countries since coming into the White House. But he's never used it in a way that came close to getting us involved in a forever war, or came close to getting us into a situation where we had boots on the ground. And if you think about Venezuela, it's sort of vintage Trump. We didn't produce regime change. All he did was lop off the leader and move the vice president up to the presidency. And the military operation itself was a couple of hours. We zipped into Caracas, kidnapped Maduro, and got out. And then he claimed a great victory, and he extolled the virtues of the American military. And this all went down very well in the United States and in the West more generally. And those are the kind of operations he likes, and they're good for him politically. But this is not Venezuela. It's also not June 22nd, 2025, when you did Operation Midnight Hammer. This is just a very different operation. And by the way, just to highlight that point, go back to the war last June, the 12-day war. We didn't have a giant armada in the Middle East like we do now. And I think what you were getting at before, quite correctly, is this time President Trump moved a huge military force into the Middle East, did not achieve any of those goals. And to have this massive armada exit the region would leave egg all over his face. So this is the problem that he faces. And if he called me up and said, "John, I want you to be my advisor. Tell me how to get out of this mess,"